Jericho and was passing through. No. Let's start again. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He is going to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost."
Thanks, Sarah. I watched the coronation last night. Watching rugby league. There was highlight was for the Presbyterian in the room, the moderator of the Church of Scotland, handed the Bible to the new king. And anyone hear what he said? He said, "This is the most valuable thing that this world affords." We are able to come and is that working? You should do a building development. Just keep talking. How did we start? I was just talking. Thanks, Andy. All right, well, how about I pray? I'll pray. And we'll make a start. Father God, thanks so much that we can meet together. Lord, we do thank you for your word to us. Lord, as we heard at the coronation last night, this is the most valuable thing that the world affords. It contains the very oracles of God. We pray that you would be shaping us by your word, that you'd be teaching us what it means to follow in the steps of Jesus as we seek to carry on his mission to seek and save the lost. Amen. The word evangelism probably brings to mind for us different ideas and different feelings. But the word evangelism, it doesn't mean that. It means simply to announce or to bring good news. It means to announce the evangel, the gospel, the good news. And that should be a great thing, shouldn't it? To tell good news to others. Who wouldn't want to be involved in that? But I think often the idea that we have in our minds about doing evangelism is probably a bit different to that. And perhaps you picture evangelism as something more like this. This is one person's experience of being part of an evangelism team that were doing shopping centre evangelism. She describes it like this. As part of an organised attempt at evangelism on a mission trip, we were sent into a local shopping centre. We set up a puppet play and we had clowns that were positively frightening. Children were shopping with their parents at the supermarket, and it was our job to wait at the checkout, hand the children balloons and lollies and tracts, and coerce them into watching the puppet show at the same time as handing an invitation to their parents to attend the local church. The problem was the parents just wanted to do shopping and go home. They were angry, they were turned off, and some of them threw the tracts on the ground. They were saying things like, "We just want to do our shopping." It was really quite negative. I would have been angry if I was one of the parents. I was embarrassed as a Christian because I thought it treated the children without dignity and treated the parents without respect, and it had no relationship attached to any of it. We could have been selling cars or raffle tickets. Wonder if you ever been involved in an experience of evangelism like that? Or maybe is that the kind of thing that comes to mind when you hear the word evangelism? Is that the kind of thing that you think you're going to get roped into? Something that will embarrass you, something that treats people like sales targets and is devoid of relationship. I think it's that comment at the end that it had no relationship attached to any of it that really captures the awkwardness that we sometimes feel about evangelism. I remember reading some time ago this book by Nabil Qureshi, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. It's a great book to read, and it's about his story of how he grew up as a Muslim in Pakistan, but how he came to faith in Jesus and eventually became an evangelist himself. He moved to America as a teenager, and he recounts in his story how he would sometimes see Christians preaching on the street. And he said that he admired them for their courage, and he often couldn't understand why Christians that he met at school or other places didn't talk more freely about their faith. But he said that while he admired their courage, he never really got any sense that they cared about him or that they loved him. And what was missing was relationship. Now this term on Sundays and in our midweek small groups, we're going to be thinking about mission and evangelism together. We're going to do that using these two resources, John Dixon's book, Promoting the Gospel. That's what this sermon series is based on. And in our small groups, we're using the city-to-city material that we've been given, the ripple effect material. And you'd be glad to know that in both of those, the approach to mission and evangelism is very relational. They understand the importance of relationships and recognise that the way that God most often brings people to faith is through ordinary, everyday relationships with believers as we seek to prayerfully and lovingly promote the gospel to our friends and family and those in our social networks. And what we're going to see today is how relationship-based evangelism is how it's always been done. But what is crucial for us as believers is that we will have an outward-looking mindset that is seeking the good of others so that they might be saved. And so to explore that today, we're going to see firstly the mindset of Jesus, his missional mindset as he comes to seek and save the lost. And then we'll see how that mindset continues and is transferred to the Apostle Paul. And then finally how that is then transferred to us. That same outward-looking mindset that we are to have as the gospel has been passed on to us. And a key verse for us is at the end of 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul lays it out. He says, "For I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved." And he says to the Corinthians, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Well, let's start today with the example of Christ. What is his mindset? Well, it's in that passage that we just read from Luke 19 about Jesus and Zacchaeus that we see the mindset of Jesus so clearly. You might like to have a look at that passage. Really, I think there's no better summary of what Jesus came to do than what Jesus himself tells us there in verse 10, where he says, "For the Son of Man," he's talking about himself, "for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." This is Jesus' mission. This is what his whole life is about. He comes to seek and save the lost. It's quite significant, the context in Luke's Gospel where Jesus says this. This is, you notice, the final event before Jesus will go into Jerusalem, where he will in the next week be crucified and then rise again. And so this passage and this statement of Jesus' mission really comes as the climax of Luke's recording of everything that Jesus has been teaching his disciples over the last 3 years. And you notice as you read this story just how relational Jesus is. He comes into Jericho where short Zacchaeus has climbed up the tree so that he can see over the crowd. Jesus spots him, but he doesn't just preach at him. He says, I'm going to your place for dinner tonight. And verse 7, it says there that all of the people in the crowd begin to mutter. And what do they say? Well, they say, oh, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. And what they mean by that is that Zacchaeus is someone who, well, a good religious person like Jesus, well, he shouldn't be hanging out with someone like him. In the mindset of the Jewish people, Zacchaeus was someone to keep away from. He's the chief tax collector. He's made himself wealthy by being a traitor to the Jewish people, but Jesus seeks him out, relates to him generously, goes to his house, shares a meal with him. You can only imagine the kind of conversation that they had over that meal. But in the way that Jesus treats Zacchaeus, well, he gets a glimpse of the kindness of God, the welcome, the grace of God, and it transforms him. And as we read through the Gospels, well, this is how Jesus regularly relates to those who are regarded as sinners. We are all sinners, but in the mindset of the Jewish people, there are some that are more sinners than others. But see how Jesus relates to them. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus calls Levi, a tax collector, to follow him, and Jesus has a meal at his house. So it says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, well, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Well, he eats with them because this is who he came to save. He shares his life with them. Another example in Luke chapter 7. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of a woman she is, that she is a sinner. In response to what the Pharisee says there, well, Jesus then tells a parable about how those who have been forgiven much love much. He says that this woman's sins have been forgiven. Another time we see Jesus open welcome to sinners is the parable of the lost sons. The beginning of that section in Luke 15 tells us who the audience is for that parable. It's this. It says the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. You notice the two groups. There's the bad people, the tax collectors and sinners, and there's the good people, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And then Jesus goes on to tell this parable about a father who runs out and welcomes the bad son. But the shocking ending of the parable is that the son who stayed home and always did what was right is left out of the parable. And to me, this story of Zacchaeus and Jesus is just another example of Jesus showing this mindset in his mission. That this is who he came to seek and to save, those who are lost from God. He came to bring forgiveness and welcome back into his family. He teaches about this salvation in his ministry. He embodies it in how he relates people around him. And then, as you keep reading through the next chapters, he accomplishes this salvation through his death and his resurrection. And friends, for us, as we think about evangelism and being on mission together in our mindset, Well, the first thing to see here is that it's Jesus' mission that needs to shape our mission. It's really his mission, isn't it? And as you read through the Gospels, one thing you notice is that there's no kind of cringe factor in the way that Jesus relates to others. Instead, there's this compassion and this way of relating that is warm and welcoming and it's very natural and attractive. Now, I know that Jesus is the master, and so it's a pretty high bar to say we should just do it like him. But we can learn from him. We can learn to have his heart of compassion. And we can learn to relate to people around us in ways that are natural and relational and that embody and express that welcoming grace and kindness of God. Because as we see, it's not just Jesus who has this mindset, but it's also the Apostle Paul who has the same outlook and attitude. Now that wasn't always Paul's outlook. When we first meet him in the book of Acts, he is one of those Pharisees who observes strictly the Jewish law and is looking down on those so-called sinners. And as we meet him in the early chapters of Acts, he's a persecutor of believers in Jesus. But after he himself encounters Jesus, sees him alive, risen from the dead, has his eyes opened, well, Paul then becomes and devotes his life to proclaiming the good news about Jesus. And one of the things you see through the New Testament is that Paul in his ministry is quite often finds himself in conflict with Jewish Christians because of the way he so freely and openly relates to those outsiders, especially the way that he relates to Gentiles, to those considered sinners. And not only does he preach to them and seek their salvation, but he shares his life with them. He even shares his meal table with them. And I think in that you just see a clear reflection of Jesus' own practice of associating with sinners. And we saw in our reading from Corinthians earlier that this is Paul's mindset and his outlook on life. Let me read some of that again. You might like to turn there in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and 10 as well. But here's the first part on the screen. 1 Corinthians 9, this is Paul's missional mindset. He says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. So Paul, like Jesus, orients everything in his life toward the salvation of outsiders. And he does this for exactly the same reason as Jesus, so that by all possible means I might save some. You notice this is not a tactic that he uses to just get people in the door so he can help them with the gospel. It's not like tricking people like that story before with the clowns at the birth show. And Paul uses the freedom that he has as a believer in Jesus to then adjust his own life and behaviour so that no barrier will be put in the way to stop people from engaging with the gospel. So when he is with Jewish people, he respects their customs. And then when he's with Gentiles, he respects their ways. When he's with the weak, and by that it means Christians who are weak in their faith, he behaves in a way that will not cause them to stumble. Now this section here in 1 Corinthians, really starting from chapter 8 going through to the end of chapter 10, is wrestling with this issue of how we behave as Christians and how it is that we should use the freedom that we have. An example Paul sets for us is that his mindset, it's not about doing what he wants or asserting his rights or pleasing himself. But instead, he is willing to give up his rights and give up his privileges for the sake of the mission. So that by all possible means, now, of course, who has Paul learned that from? He's learned that from Jesus. Because this is what the gospel teaches us, it's what the cross shows us. The one who had all rights and all privileges, they gave up everything in order to seek and save the lost. That for you, me, to save us as we were lost. And so at the end of this section, Paul says to us, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So what will that look like for us to do that? For us to have the same mindset as Paul and as Jesus before him? Well, if we do have the mindset of Jesus and Paul, well, this is how John Dickson summarises it. He says that our lives should be governed by three goals. And these all come out of Paul's summary at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So you might like to just look at that. So firstly from 1 Corinthians 10 verse 31, he says the first goal is this, that we live with a desire to bring glory to the one true Lord. So 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And so that is the big goal in all of life, to live for God's glory. Because as we heard last week from Psalm 96, there is one Lord to whom all people belong and owe their allegiance. Our lives belong to God, and so everything in our lives is to be oriented toward his glory. If we are to have the mindset of Jesus and Paul, that is to be the first overarching goal. And then the second and third goals really unpack what that is like. So the second is that we do nothing that would cause anyone to stumble. And you see that what Paul says next in verse 32, he says, do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. Now, stumbling in Paul's letters is about people missing out on salvation. So the goal here is it's not about just avoiding upsetting people, it's about not acting in ways that will put the salvation of others at risk. And the example of that, which Paul is unpacking in these chapters, is a warning about not leading weaker believers into idol worship by participating in meals where the food has been offered to idols. And you might hear that and think, well, that's maybe not a huge issue for me and my neighbours, but I think it's worth thinking hard about the principle behind this and what might be some actions or behaviours that would stop or hinder people from experiencing God's mercy. I mean, are there things about how we do church here on a Sunday that make it difficult for outsiders to come in and do their own? Or maybe thinking about how you relate to people in work, how we relate to people at work or in our different social settings. Are there ways in which we behave or speak or act that are putting up a barrier and stopping people around you from engaging with the gospel? I think these are probably hard things for us to recognise, but this is to be our goal, our desire to do nothing that would cause anyone to stumble. And the more positive way to state that is the third goal, the next goal, that says we actively pursue the salvation of others. So this is what Paul says in verse 33, I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Now, what we're going to learn through this term from John Dickson's book is that there are many ways that we actively pursue the salvation of others. But I wanted today just to finish briefly by reminding us of what Julianne shared with us about a month ago. Do you remember the 4 PR words that she gave us in that workshop? These were 4 encouragements to actively pursue the salvation of others. Wonder how we're going with those. Are we devoting ourselves to prayer? But one of the action points is to start praying for maybe 5 people who you know who don't know Jesus yet. The next PR was proclaim. And the first action point is, are we able to talk about Jesus and our faith in a natural way? Doing the ripple effect material in our small groups is going to be a great way to help us with that. If you're not in a group, it's a great time to join into one of those groups. The third is to prioritise. Are we making space in our lives for deepening relationships with others? And I think we learned today from the example of Paul and Jesus, well, hospitality is going to be key to them. Are we setting aside some time in a week where we can share our lives with others? And the fourth was prepare. Prepare for conversations, prepare yourself, prepare to invite. It's my hope that as we are encouraged in being on mission together on Sundays and during the week, that God will be preparing us, changing our mindset, but also preparing the hearts of our friends and neighbours to hear and receive the good news, because it is good news that we have to share. And in this room, I mean, God has made all of us differently, so we all have different opportunities, different ways to go about it, but we can all give ourselves to the same mission. We won't do it exactly how Jesus did or Paul did, but we can live with the same mindset, seeking the good of many so that they may be saved. Let me pray for God will help us to do that together. Father, we do thank you today for the good news about how you first sought and saved us through your Son, the Lord Jesus. Thank you that you came to rescue us from our sin and to bring us home into your family. But we pray that you will be guiding us and teaching us, equipping us, helping us to learn from Jesus and Paul and most of us as we seek to share the good news with our friends and families. And we ask that you help you